In the summer of 1863, the United States felt like a giant map that someone had snapped in half. The Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South faced each other after 2 years of civil war, each side convinced it had to keep fighting. Tucked into the rolling hills of Pennsylvania sat Gettysburg, a small town of farms, orchards, and crossroads. Its residents expected harvests and market days, not two giant armies suddenly marching toward their doorsteps. Confederate General Robert E. Lee believed that marching his army north into Union territory might win a huge victory and force the North to negotiate. After successes at places like Chancellorsville, his confidence was high, and his army trusted him. On the Union side, General George G. Meade had only just been given command of the Army of the Potomac. He barely had time to unpack his bags before he had to track down Lee's army and stop whatever the Confederates were planning. Gettysburg sat at the center of several key roads, like the hub of a wheel. As Lee's scattered units searched for supplies, and Meade's forces moved to counter them, both armies were pulled toward the same unsuspecting town. By the end of June, scouts and cavalry from both sides realized that major enemy forces were nearby. No one knew the exact time or place of the clash, but the feeling was clear. Something huge was about to happen. Union cavalry under General John Buford reached Gettysburg first and noticed something important. The ridges and high ground south of town were perfect for defense. He instantly knew that if the Union held those hills, they'd have a real advantage. Buford decided that his cavalry would fight dismounted, using their carbines to delay the Confederate advance. His goal wasn't to win the whole battle alone, but to buy enough time for Union infantry to arrive and take the high ground. Meanwhile, Confederate divisions moved toward Gettysburg, believing they faced only light resistance. Some were even hoping to find shoes and supplies in town, not expecting a major engagement to erupt there. General Meade still did not know exactly where Lee would strike, but reports suggested the area around Gettysburg was becoming crowded with Confederates. Trusting his instincts, he ordered his corps to concentrate in that direction. As more blue and gray uniforms appeared on the surrounding roads, Gettysburg's residents grew anxious. Shopkeepers, farmers, and families watched from porches and windows as waves of tiny soldiers marched past their homes. By the evening of June 30th, both armies were drawing closer, like two storm fronts about to collide. No one in Gettysburg chose to host a huge battle. But by chance and geography, the town was about to become famous forever. On the morning of July 1st, Buford's pickets spotted Confederate troops advancing toward the ridges west of town. He gave the order to hold them off as long as possible, even though his cavalrymen were badly outnumbered. The situation looked dangerous, but Union General John Reynolds rushed his infantry to Gettysburg at top speed. He arrived just in time to reinforce Buford's thin line and strengthen the Union position west of town. Through the late morning, Union and Confederate troops clashed fiercely along McPherson Ridge and nearby fields. Lines advanced and fell back in waves like a tense tug-of-war stretched across fences, farm lanes, and small patches of woods. General Reynolds was killed early in the fighting, a huge blow to Union morale. Yet his troops stayed in the fight, determined to honor his sacrifice by holding off the Confederate attacks as long as they could. As more Confederate units arrived, their pressure on the Union line increased. Lee's forces pushed steadily forward, gradually forcing the Union troops back toward Gettysburg itself. By afternoon, the Union positions west and north of Gettysburg began to collapse. Exhausted Union soldiers streamed back through the narrow streets, trying to reach the safety of the high ground to the south. Fortunately for the Union, retreat did not mean total defeat. Survivors rallied on Cemetery Hill and nearby heights, forming a strong defensive line on ground Buford had recognized as vital just a day earlier. Confederate troops now controlled much of Gettysburg, occupying houses, barns, and streets they had fought hard to seize. From their viewpoint, the first day looked like a clear victory and an encouraging start. Lee believed that with this success, he might be close to destroying the Union Army of the Potomac. He looked toward the hills south of town and wondered if one more determined push might bring total victory. As night fell on July 1st, both armies paused to catch their breath. Fires flickered on the hills, horses drank at streams, and countless tiny soldiers tried to sleep, knowing that the battle was far from over. General Meade arrived at Gettysburg during the night and examined the terrain by lantern light. He saw that his army now held a fishhook-shaped line on the high ground, and he decided to make a stand here instead of retreating. From Cemetery Hill down along Cemetery Ridge and curving to the rocky hill called Little Round Top, the Union position formed a rough fishhook shape. This allowed Meade to move reserves quickly along interior lines to reinforce any threatened point. Lee decided to attack the Union flanks rather than the strong center. He ordered General James Longstreet to strike the Union left, hoping to roll up the line and force Meade's army from its positions. Longstreet was uneasy about the plan. He believed that a defensive strategy might be wiser, but as Lee's subordinate he carried out the orders, marching his men into position for the afternoon attack. On the extreme left of the Union line stood Little Round Top, a rocky hill that anchored the whole position. If Confederates seized it, they could fire down the length of the Union army, turning the strong fishhook into a trap. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine were assigned to guard the far left. He was told that if his unit gave way, the entire Union line might unravel, so retreat was simply not an option. In the afternoon, Longstreet's troops attacked the Union left in wave after wave. The slopes around Little Round Top echoed with musket fire, as Chamberlain's thin line bent but refused to break. Running low on ammunition and with his men exhausted, Chamberlain made a bold decision. He ordered a bayonet charge to sweep the attackers from the hill. His men surged forward, surprising the Confederates and forcing many to retreat or surrender. While the drama unfolded on the left, fierce fighting also erupted at the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, and Devil's Den nearer the center. Positions changed hands multiple times, leaving both sides exhausted and confused. By evening, the Union line had been bent and battered, especially near the Peach Orchard, but it had not been broken. The Confederates had gained ground in places, yet the crucial heights remained in Union hands. Lee studied the Union position and concluded that Meade's center on Cemetery Ridge might now be vulnerable. The previous day's success and today's gains convinced him that one more powerful blow could win the battle. Meade, sensing another attack was coming, held a council of war with his corps commanders. Together they discussed the day's events, and Meade correctly guessed that Lee would likely strike the center next. As darkness fell on July the 2nd, both armies knew that the next day would be decisive. The ridges, hills, and fields around Gettysburg lay quiet for a few hours, holding their breath before the storm of Day 3. The morning of July 3rd broke calm and bright over Gettysburg. Both armies had already paid a terrible price, but neither side was ready to give up, and the outcome of the entire campaign hung in the balance. Lee decided on a bold, risky plan, a massive assault straight at the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. He believed that if his men could punch through, they could split Meade's army and win a war-changing victory. Longstreet argued against the attack, warning that crossing open fields under heavy fire would be disastrous. Yet in the end he obeyed orders, preparing his corps for what he feared would be a very costly charge. Among the units chosen for the assault was General George Pickett's Fresh Virginia Division. His men were well-rested and proud, unaware that history would forever attach Pickett's name to what came next. Before the infantry advanced, Confederate artillery opened a massive bombardment on the Union center. For nearly 2 hours, cannon roared and smoke filled the air, shaking the ridgeline and rattling nerves on both sides. The barrage was loud, frightening, and impressive, but much of it overshot the main Union positions. Meade's artillery held their fire at times to conserve ammunition, waiting for the infantry assault they knew was coming. At last, the Confederate guns fell mostly silent, and Pickett's men stepped out from the tree line. Thousands of tiny gray-coated soldiers formed long lines and began marching steadily across the open fields toward Cemetery Ridge. The distance to the Union line was over a kilometer of mostly open ground. As the Confederates advanced, Union artillery and infantry opened fire, turning the fields into a deadly stretch of smoke, noise, and chaos. Despite terrible losses, parts of the attacking force made it close to the stone wall at the top of Cemetery Ridge. Union units rushed to plug gaps and reinforce the threatened sections of the line. For a brief moment, Confederate soldiers actually reached and crossed parts of the stone wall. This spot, where the attackers came closest to breaking the Union line, is now remembered as the high water mark of the Confederacy. The Union counterattacks and concentrated fire finally broke the momentum of the charge. Exhausted and decimated, the surviving Confederates retreated back across the fields, Pickett's proud division now shattered. Lee met the returning troops and took responsibility for the failure, telling them the disaster was his fault, not theirs. Pickett, deeply shaken, reportedly could barely think about reforming what was left of his command. With Pickett's charge repelled, Lee's last hope for victory at Gettysburg had vanished. The Confederate army could no longer take the offensive here, and the momentum of the battle had swung decisively to the Union. After 3 days of furious combat, the battlefield finally fell quiet. Fields once full of marching lines now held broken equipment, abandoned positions, and thousands of weary, stunned survivors from both sides. By holding his positions and repelling the final assault, Meade had clearly won the battle. The Union Army of the Potomac, though battered, remained in control of the high ground and the town of Gettysburg. Recognizing that his army could no longer continue the fight here, Lee began withdrawing back toward Virginia. The retreat was slowed by rain, mud, and the sheer number of wounded and exhausted soldiers. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln received word of the Union victory with relief and hope. Yet he also understood the enormous cost and wished Meade had perhaps struck harder at Lee's retreating army. Gettysburg had produced staggering casualties, more than 50,000 killed, wounded, or missing on both sides combined. Almost every unit that fought there carried home stories of loss, courage, and survival. The defeat at Gettysburg, combined with other Union victories that summer, weakened the Confederacy's ability to take the offensive. From this point forward, Lee's army mostly fought on the defensive inside the South. For the Union, Gettysburg became a symbol that the tide of war could turn. Many in the North saw the victory as proof that perseverance and better use of terrain and numbers could eventually bring the conflict to an end. Even after Gettysburg, the Civil War continued for nearly 2 more years. The battle was a turning point, not a final ending, and both sides still faced many hardships before peace would return. In the months following the battle, attention turned to how to honor the fallen. The fields and hills around Gettysburg were chosen as the site for a national cemetery dedicated to those who had died there. In November 1863, President Lincoln journeyed to Gettysburg to speak at the dedication of the cemetery. He was not the main speaker on the program, but his brief remarks would become some of the most famous words in American history. Lincoln's Gettysburg address was astonishingly short, only a couple of minutes long. Yet in those few sentences he honored the dead, explained the meaning of the war, and called for a new birth of freedom in the nation. The speech reframed the Civil War as a struggle not just for union, but for the principle that all people are created equal. Gettysburg became not only a military turning point, but also a moral and political one. Over the years, monuments to regiments, batteries, and commanders appeared across the Gettysburg landscape. Each marker tells a story about where units stood, struggled, and sacrificed during those 3 intense days. Today, Gettysburg serves as a place to study leadership, strategy, and the consequences of decisions made under pressure. It also reminds visitors of the enormous cost of civil conflict within a single country. Though more than a century and a half have passed, the echoes of Gettysburg still resonate. Books, films, and visits to the battlefield keep its stories alive, helping each new generation reflect on war, peace, and national identity. In just 3 days, Gettysburg saw an accidental meeting of armies turn into a decisive clash. From Buford's first stand to Pickett's charge and the quiet afterward, every hour added another piece to the story. Seen through our chibi lens, the key commanders become tiny but memorable characters. Lee, the bold strategist; Meade, the cautious defender; Longstreet, the reluctant attacker; Buford, the observant scout; Chamberlain, the unlikely hero; and Pickett, the tragic name on a doomed charge. Gettysburg shows how hills, ridges, and even stone fences can shape the outcome of a battle. Holding the high ground and using interior lines gave the Union advantages that no amount of bravery alone could replace. Behind every arrow on a map were real people making hard choices and facing fear. By studying battles like Gettysburg, we can better understand both the courage and the suffering that come with war. History does not exist just to list winners and losers. It offers warnings, insights, and examples that can help future generations choose dialogue and compromise over conflict whenever possible. Our tiny warriors may be cute, but the lessons they carry are serious. Gettysburg teaches about leadership, resilience, and the importance of holding firm when the stakes are highest. Thank you for journeying through the Battle of Gettysburg with Tiny Titans History. Tell us in the comments which battle, leader, or ancient civilization you'd like to see turned into our next chibi-sized epic.